The storm had been building all afternoon, thick clouds rolling in from the ridge like a herd with purpose. By dusk, the valley was drowning in rain. Elias Ward gripped the reins of his old truck, headlights cutting through sheets of water as he crawled along the flooded dirt road. He should have turned back an hour ago, but then he'd heard it, thin and desperate, the sound of something crying beyond the wind. It wasn't human. It was smaller, sharper. A colt. He killed the engine and stepped into the storm. Mud pulled at his boots. Rain stung his face. The sound came again, somewhere near the dry creek bed. He followed it, flashlight trembling in his hand, until the beam caught on movement. Small, wild, half-buried. The colt lay tangled in wire, its sides heaving, eyes wide with terror. Elias knelt, breath cloudy in the cold, and whispered, "Easy, boy, easy." His voice barely carried above the thunder. The wire had bitten deep. He worked it loose with bleeding fingers, the storm thrashing around him like an angry god. When the last strand snapped, the colt tried to rise and collapsed. Elias gathered it close, feeling its heart hammer against his chest. The animal's breath was shallow, its body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He didn't think. He only acted, throwing his coat over its shivering frame and pressing a steady hand to its neck. Minutes passed, or hours. Time was strange in storms. When the rain began to fade, Elias lifted the colt into his arms. It wasn't heavy, just fragile, the way broken things often are. He carried it toward the faint outline of the old barn, a relic his father built before the valley had forgotten their name. Inside, the air was damp and still, smelling of hay long turned to dust. He set the colt down near the hearth, coaxing a small fire to life with shaking hands. The light reached across the walls, revealing a life once lived here, tools rusted to memory, a horseshoe nailed above the door. The colt stirred, letting out a weak breath. Elias tore a strip from his flannel shirt, cleaned the wound, and whispered the kind of words meant less for understanding than for comfort. The rhythm of it soothed him, too. When the flame steadied, he sat back, watching the animal's sides rise and fall. The storm had moved on, leaving only the slow drip of rain from the eaves. For the first time in months, the silence felt full instead of empty. Elias exhaled, his body aching, his hands raw. "You made it," he murmured. Outside, the valley steamed under a torn sky. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wild grass. And something else. Distant hoofbeats, low and rhythmic, fading into the dark. Elias glanced toward the open door, unaware that the sound was not fading at all, but circling back. Morning came slow, spilling over the valley in a pale, forgiving light. The storm had stripped the land bare, leaving everything washed and new. Elias woke to the smell of damp wood and the quiet sound of breathing that wasn't his own. The colt lay near the fire, its head lifted, eyes clearer than before. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach far, but meant something. "Still with me," he murmured, pouring water into a tin bowl. The colt drank shakily, and something like pride flickered in his chest. He stepped outside to fetch more firewood, boots sinking into the softened earth. The air was cold and sweet, touched by the scent of wet sage. But then he stopped. Across the pasture, half veiled in mist, stood a line of shapes, tall, still, watching. Horses. Mares. 6 of them. Their coats slick with dew, their breath visible in the chill. They were silent but alert, eyes fixed on him with a depth that unsettled and fascinated. Elias froze, understanding without words that they had come for the colt. The wild herd of the ridge, untamed, unclaimed, creatures that had learned to trust nothing human. He'd seen them before, distant as ghosts, vanishing at the crack of a branch. But this time they didn't run. They only watched, as though measuring him. He raised his hand in the smallest of gestures, not dominance, but greeting. The lead mare flicked her ear, taking one slow step forward before stopping again. He backed toward the barn, not out of fear but respect, leaving the door open. The Maras didn't follow. They lingered, hooves shifting in the damp earth, waiting. Inside, the colt had risen, wobbling on thin legs. When Elias placed a handful of hay near its muzzle, it hesitated before eating, its movements uncertain yet hungry. "They're out there for you," Elias said quietly. "But you're not ready to go." He sat beside the fire as daylight deepened, the warmth painting the walls gold. The colt's breathing steadied, its small body casting a faint shadow beside his own. Every so often he caught the flicker of movement through the open door, tails swishing, silhouettes gliding through fog. The herd hadn't left. They were keeping watch. The quiet pressed in, not heavy, but aware. Elias found himself talking to Colt more than he realized, about the storms, the empty house on the hill, the silence that came after loss. The animal listened as though it knew the shape of loneliness. When dusk returned, the fog thickened and the Maras moved closer to the fence line, their presence like sentinels carved from mist. Elias fed the fire one last log, listening to it crackle. "You've got company tonight," he whispered. The colt blinked slowly, curling near the warmth. Outside, a single soft nicker rose in answer, low, certain, and near. Elias looked up, realizing the herd had no intention of leaving. Not yet. Days blurred into a quiet rhythm, marked by feeding, mending, and the soft rustle hooves outside the barn. The colt, Ash, as Elias had started calling him, grew stronger, steadier, his legs less uncertain with each dawn. He followed Elias now, nosing at his sleeve, learning the cadence of a human's presence. The Maras never strayed far. They lingered beyond the fence like a patient tide, neither threatening nor retreating. Elias felt their watchfulness as both comfort and reminder. He had borrowed what belonged to the wild. Each morning, he found signs of their closeness. Hoofprints circling the barn, tufts of grass flattened where they'd lain through the night. He began speaking to them as he worked, his voice low and even, like one side of an old conversation. "You'll have him back soon," he'd say, though he wasn't sure whether the words were meant for them or for himself. The barn had become more than shelter. It was a pulse in the valley, a fragile line between solitude and belonging. Sometimes Elias thought he saw his wife's scarf move where hung on a nail by the door, caught by a draft only memory could feel. He'd lost her to a fever years ago, but her voice returned now in echoes, gentle, insistent. "Don't turn away from what still breathes." One evening, the horizon blushed with firelight, not from the barn, but the sunset spilling over the ridge, painting the Maras in bronze and gold. They began to gather, one by one, until the entire herd stood in perfect silence. Ash lifted his head, ears pricked. Elias felt the shift, the kind of stillness that comes before something sacred. The lead mare stepped forward. Her coat gleamed like wet clay, her dark eyes holding a strange knowing. She walked the length of the fence, stopping a few paces from Elias. Ash whinnied softly, trembling between fear and recognition. Elias opened the gate without thinking. The mare crossed the threshold, breath steaming in the cool air, and nudged her muzzle against the colt's neck. It was a gesture of claiming, but also of gratitude. Elias waited for them to leave together, but they didn't. The rest of the herd moved in slowly, encircling the barn in complete silence. 12 of them, forming a ring of stillness and breath, their eyes reflecting the dying light. Elias stood at the center, one hand resting on Ash's mane, the other at his side, unsure if he was being judged or blessed. The air shimmered with quiet. For a heartbeat, man and herd shared the same breath, the same warmth, the same fragile thread of understanding. Then, as if in some ancient agreement, the Maras bowed their heads, not to submit, but to acknowledge. Elias exhaled, the ache in his chest loosening. The moment held, then passed, leaving behind only the sound of wind moving through grass, like a whisperer saying stay. Morning came soft and silver, the kind of light that makes everything seem forgiven. The herd was gone. The ground outside the barn was a tapestry of hoofprints pressed deep into the thawing earth, each one filled with rainwater that shimmered like glass. Ash stood near the open door, head high, tail flicking at the cold, as if waiting for permission to follow. Elias leaned against the post, arms folded, a quiet ache settling beneath his ribs. He had done what he came to do. Saved a life, maybe his own in the process, but parting still felt like loss. He walked the fence line with slow steps, testing the boards, mending what the storm had broken. His hands worked without thought, the rhythm steady, the task grounding. When the wind shifted, he could almost hear the Mars again, their hooves drumming faintly through memory, their breathing blending with the sound of leaves. He wondered if they had truly accepted him that night, or if grace like that only visits once and vanishes before man can name it. Ash followed him everywhere now, a shadow with a pulse. When Elias paused, the colt pressed close, eyes bright and steady. "You'll go when it's time," Elias murmured, tracing a line along his neck. The words tasted both true and hollow. At dusk, he lit a lantern in the barn window, the flame trembling in its glass like a heartbeat. It wasn't for the colt. It was for the herd, a signal cast into the dark, though he couldn't have said why. Days passed. Frost crept back across the grass, thin and glinting. The valley felt wider, emptier. Yet one evening, as the sky bruised indigo, the sound returned, faint at first, then certain. Hoofbeats. Elias stepped outside, breath clouding in the cold. The herd had come back, 12 Mars moving as one, their coats gleaming beneath the pale moonlight. They stopped short of the fence, their eyes catching the lantern's glow. The lead mare lifted her head, then bowed once, deliberate and calm. Ash answered with a sharp whinny, trotting toward them, the space between wild and human closing in a single heartbeat. Elias didn't try to hold him back. The colt crossed the gate and pressed his muzzle to the lead mare's chest, a reunion without sound or struggle. For a long moment, they simply stood together, the herd and the man watching one another across a thin line of trust. Elias smiled faintly, the kind that comes from something settled deep. He turned down the lantern wick, its glow dimming to amber. Snow began to fall, soft, slow, forgiving. Ash lingered near the fence once more, eyes on the barn, before following the herd into the dark. Elias whispered into the stillness, "Go on, boy. You're home." The wind carried his words away, leaving only the sound of hooves fading and the warmth of one small light burning against the cold.